heading out to Dubai on Motzei Shabbat.
Ooh, for fun, or?
Well, first work and then fun. So I have a presentation to give on Sunday, and I'm trying to figure out how to maneuver it because you also have to be politically correct and everything.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Is that your first time?
To Dubai, yeah.
Okay, that's great. It's great. I'm very close with Rabbi Sarna, who has been there. His kids and our kids, my kids are very close, and so.
Do you know if he'll be there on Hanukkah?
I think they're planning to be there at some point in Hanukkah. But they often will decide kind of last minute. But
well, maybe I'm going to try to reach out anyway because we want to do a conference.
I'm happy to introduce you if you don't know him.
Please do.
Oh, he's the best. He's the best. I love Yehuda's great, and his wife is the best. Well, we're very close.
So wouldn't mind doing an email introduction. I'd really appreciate that.
I would love to. If I don't do it right after this, just email me to remind me, and but I would love to for sure.
Great. Yeah, because we're trying to make the most of it while we're there. Welcome, people, as you're coming in, not walking in. And we'll give everybody a few more minutes to join. I love this view with the synagogue and then the mosque right there. And then where's there's a church somewhere right there also in that square.
Have you been there?
No, I haven't been to Suriname, but I met this guy in Amsterdam who used to be part of the Snoga, and he's from Suriname. And I just got so into the Surinamese story, and that's why I've been reading her book so much. And I just
it's rich and layered and complicated, and complex,
and I love the interactions that they had there. That it's like this is the square with all the different. The only other place I saw that was in Chennamangala in India. That they had a Hindu temple up highest because it's India, but then right among it had a mosque and a church and a synagogue. And actually the synagogue's cemetery was in back of the mosque.
Huh.
Because you can't bury by a synagogue.
Right.
Well, this is interesting what you just said, Rhoda. Where is that you visited?
In Chennamangala in India.
So that's a really good example. Up till now, it was the only example of adjacency of a mosque to a synagogue that I knew of outside of the land of Israel, I suppose, the state of Israel. But now, yes, of course, once you head over to further into Asia.
Well, specifically, Chennamangala was built specifically, and I don't remember the name of the Hindu that decided that this should be a bastion of peace. And so that city, if you, what's her name? Shalva Weil wrote about it. And she actually helped with the synagogue and everything to create it into a museum type of thing. So it's interesting.
I have to read more about that. So it was an intentional adjacency.
Yeah.
Very much so.
I wonder what economic driver was there. They were probably wanting to welcome different merchant communities and we hear someone is mentioning that in Cochin.
In Cochin, but there's Jew Street. Cochin is separate.
That's Thomas.
Oh, I can't transfer her. Okay, well then Helene's going to hang out with us here.
Yes, I am.
No, but you're fine. Just keep your video off. That's fine.
Okay.
And you need to share, Aviva. You have a.
Yes, I'm going to. 1 second.
Let's just test that before we start.
I hear a little buzzing noise. Do you all hear that?
I hear it too.
I don't. Let me see if I can.
Oh, it went off. 1 second. Oh,
Great.
now it's gone. Whoop.
Yeah, sometimes I have to switch my microphone, so thank you for pointing that out, because it does get annoying.
Okay, anyway, here's the shared PowerPoint. Are you able to see that?
We are. Great. Just, put it into presentation mode.
Yes, I will. Yeah, let me just start moving down here.
Okay, welcome everybody. We'll start in about another minute or two. Thank you for joining. Giving everybody a chance to come in and giving everybody here a chance to get themselves organized. Oh, you know what? Oh, here, I can move you over, Elaine. Thanks for coming. We'll see you soon. I just moved Elaine over, hopefully. Yeah. There you go. Perfect. Okay. Do you want to leave it open from the beginning, or?
Do you want me to shut it? It's up to you. I don't mind.
Yeah, usually we shut it just so that we, as long as we know it works, we're happy.
Okay, good. Am I still in screen share?
You are still in screen share, yeah. But I can take it from you.
Sounds good. But I did want to mention the buzzing noise is still there. I can deal with it.
No, I don't want you to have to. Let me see if I can fix it again. Oh, because I thought you said it was gone. How about now?
It's gone.
It's gone. We'll see if it comes back. So let me know if it comes back. I'm going to go on mute soon anyway, so it's okay.
Okay.
So welcome everybody. Before we begin, I just want to say thank you to all of you for joining and for coming with us on this first journey of these New Works Wednesdays. I think it was really a successful run here. We got some wonderful feedback, and we're ending on a very strong note with a very strong book. As I was just telling Professor Ben-Ur and Professor Pelengrino, I have this affinity for Suriname. I just began to learn about it in Amsterdam and have not stopped researching it. So you can see I actually have to go back now and figure out all the differences, what I can take out of there and put into other things I'm doing. But so thank you for the book, and thank you all for joining us, and thank you for the new works. So I just want to point out what is coming up before we begin. I'll also show it at the end, but we have a writing workshop coming up. Our New Works Wednesdays in January will actually not be academic new works. It'll be works of fiction and memoirs. So it's not a scholarly work, it's more of a personal work. We also, for those who were there yesterday at the visit to the Bulgarian synagogue, we're going to go to the Jewish Heritage Museum, and I'm very excited about that. And for those who are interested in Arabic calligraphy, we have on December 17th. So I do look forward to seeing you all there and telling your friends about it. I will put my email there in case there are any questions. And before we begin, I just want to point out some technicalities, some logistics. You obviously do not have your cameras on and your microphones on. Possibly at the end, if things work out well, we will open up microphones and cameras for questions. But in the meantime, we'll allow Professor Ben-Ur to give her presentation. If you have questions that are immediate, please put them into the Q&A. If you have a technical issue, please put it into the chat. I'll be looking at it. And also put into the chat where you're from. That also, it's nice to see where people are from and just say hi. So on that note, I will turn the floor over to Professor Pelengrino, and I will put myself on mute.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. This has been, as George said, really a powerful run of Wednesday afternoon talks. Perfect if you're on the East Coast to have during your lunch, or if you're in across the Atlantic at dinner time, and to explore with depth, with nuance, with sophistication, aspects of Jewish history that are often overlooked. And we traveled in time. We started out talking about the World War II era in the Middle East, We've gone to India. We've gone to the Caribbean. We're going back to the Caribbean, thankfully, which is nice as things get cold up here to imagine warmer sites. And we've dealt with, a lot of, hard questions, difficult issues, and also really exciting, creative approaches to history. And I really want to thank, it's been an honor for the Schneier Program in International Affairs and Yeshiva University to co-sponsor this with the American Sephardi Federation. Drora's vision here and her guidance in putting this together has just been wonderful. And so I look forward to many more great collaborations. And I want to welcome our guest, Professor Aviva Ben-Ur, who is professor in Judaic and Near Eastern Studies at University of Massachusetts Amherst. She's author of a previous book, Sephardic Jews in America, Diasporic History, which really, if you want to learn something about the early modern history of Sephardim in North America, it's a great place to go. You really learn. I learned so much from reading it a couple of years back, and it's something I reference often in my teaching. It's a really wonderful book, and I look forward to reading this book, which is Jewish Autonomy in a Slave Society. And I'm going to leave it to Professor Ben-Ur to guide us through this really, really important topic. And I'm really honored and excited to be here. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ronnie, and also Drora. I'd also like to thank the Institute of Jewish Experience, as well as your co-sponsors, the ASF and Yeshiva University Sephardic Studies. It's wonderful to be here. And I'm so grateful not only for the technology that brings us together, but also for the very live interest of the broader community, both scholarly and non-scholarly. It just, the output of lectures is so inspiring, and I've been keeping up with them as well. And it is such an important tool for us as learners of the past. So I'm going to transition to my slideshow and just also receive confirmation from Ronnie and Drora that you are able to see it, the slideshow. Let me see, have I disconnected?
Not yet.
Okay, so I'm gonna start a new share then. And let me just go back here. This should do it.
Yep, now we see it.
All right,
Yes,
excellent.
wonderful.
All right, so let's begin. Classical Jewish texts from the Hebrew Bible to the Talmud and the biblical exegetes are replete with a knowledge and memory of slavery. Consider, for example, the Torah's account of the Exodus from Egypt and Rashi's commentary on Joseph's capture by slave traders. And yet Jewish studies scholarship does not typically incorporate the history of enslavement and slave ownership as lived experiences. One reason for this general absence is that slavery as a lived reality is what anthropologists call a sensitive topic. On both a popular level and in much of the scholarly world, a great deal of what is commonly known about Jews in New World slave societies is tied to the intention to defame Jews, both living and dead. Writing of this caliber emphasizes that Jews played a disproportionate role in the African slave trade, or that scholars should not focus on Jews only as victims, but also as perpetrators. Neither the public nor most scholars until recently have been interested in anchoring knowledge about Jews and slavery in credible sources and analysis. Even today, a number of well-regarded historians have unselfconsciously emphasized the need to, quote unquote, undermine myths about the moral exceptionality of Jews, or point out that, quote, the image of the persecuted Jew in an era of continued violence in Palestine is increasingly problematic, but also in a Surinamese historical context, largely untenable. These are not historical arguments and would be flagged if applied to virtually any other nonconforming group. It is no surprise then that the most impactful histories of Jews and modern slavery have been reactive. That is, these studies have either sought to defend Jews from ahistorical and sometimes blatantly anti-Semitic publications that describe Jews as the cruelest of slave owners and as initiators of the Atlantic slave trade. Eli Faber's Jews, Slaves, and the Slave Trade, Setting the Record Straight from about 22 years ago, was the first to empirically refute the conclusion that Jews dominated the slave trade as financiers and as merchants. Other recent studies have sought to dismiss such defenses of Jews as apologia. Jonathan Schorsch in his Jews and Blacks in the Early Modern World, which came out in 2004, argued that Jews of European origin did not differ from the majority of white Christians among whom they lived in terms of attitudes and behavior towards people of African origin. Whether defensive of Jews or dismissive of pro-Jewish apologia, all of these studies remain straitjacketed within a binary that frames Jews as either persecutors, or protectors of enslaved Africans and their descendants. One alternative is to recognize that the eyewitness accounts Jews created in slave societies are unparalleled in their sustained serial nature, spanning hundreds of years, and are unparalleled in their complexity and in their depth. As such, these Jewish records are an indispensable source for understanding slave societies writ large. Slave societies have always produced an inevitable mixture of populations, and it is this very mingling that hurls history and its actors into exceptionally unanticipated directions. The records created and preserved by Jews living in slave societies capture these exceptionally unanticipated directions, and they do so in multiple languages, but primarily in Hebrew, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch. Arguably, no Jewish community has produced more records about slave society than the Jewish community of Suriname in South America. Suriname is centered on the Wild Coast, or Guyana, a vast area that stretched from Venezuela to Brazil. Roughly the size of the US state of Georgia, Suriname borders the Atlantic Ocean to its north and is bounded by French Guiana to the east, English-speaking Guyana to the west, and Portuguese-speaking Brazil to the south. The northern coast of South America was a region where the English, French, and Dutch had traded since the late 16th century. Suriname was first colonized in 1651 and passed virtually without bloodshed to English and Dutch hands, from English to Dutch hands in 1667. And Suriname remained a Dutch colony for most of the 3 centuries leading up to its independence in 1975. Suriname's Jews deserve our sustained attention for the following 3 reasons, as I argue in my book. First, Jews were the only ethnic group outside of the colonial government itself, that created serial records that stretch across the entire period of slavery and beyond. Second, because Jews formed 1/3, and in the first 19th century, up to 1/2 and even 2/3 of the white population, their experiences and observations can be considered in many respects representative of life in the colony. Lastly, Surinamese Jews were exceptional among Jews in other slave territories in that they admitted a significant number of Eurafricans, that is, people of mixed European and African descent, and also to a lesser extent admitted people of African ancestry into their community and regarded them as bona fide Jews. As we shall see, many of these slaves and their descendants articulated their own experiences, particularly if manumitted or freeborn. Suriname was a slave society par excellence, and here I would like to distinguish between a slave society and societies with slaves. In societies with slaves, such as those of the US North, slavery was not the mainstay of the economy. By contrast, a slave society, as defined by most scholars, was a society whose economy was largely dependent on slave labor, so that if this labor force were to have suddenly been freed or removed by expulsion, the entire economy would have collapsed. In slave societies, at least 1/3 of the population was held in bondage for an extended period of time, and slavery fundamentally defined local economies. With upwards of 90% of its population in chains by the late 18th century, Suriname was a colony overqualified for the slave society label. As anthropologist Michel Rolf Trujillo notes, the people who lived in such societies, free or not, lived there because there were slaves. And this is a statement that holds true with only slight exaggeration when you consider the Native American populations of various Caribbean colonies. Also, in a slave society, all aspects of life were influenced by slavery. So not just economic, but also every social and cultural niche, including religion, language, dress, clothing, leisure, sexual relations, physical discipline, and also humor. And in the image on the slide to the lower right, we see an illustration by a Dutch Christian artist, Christian Andriessen. It shows the artist giving a private tutorial to two pupils while he disciplines their younger brother through the mock mimicry of the Spanish buck torture. Physical torture was a daily reality in the lives of slaves. In Suriname, 7 distinct street corners of the capital city of Paramaribo were reserved for the Spanish buck, known in Dutch as the Spansa bok. This included, by the way, a street corner that intersected with a heavily Jewishly populated street, the Jewish Broadway Street in Paramaribo. The Spanish buck was also carried out in the Jewish village of Jodensavanne, which I'll talk about soon. And this village was situated along the banks of the Suriname River adjacent to the rainforest. The streets of this village and the fence surrounding its synagogue square served as habitual sites for administering the Spanish buck. This publicly performed infliction entailed positioning the victim cross-handed and cross-legged. One visitor in the 1770s described it as tying an individual to a device, typically a stick looped through the limbs, so that they could not make the smallest movement. Their backs were then whipped until the entire skin was ripped off, and maggots swarmed on the festering wounds. This form of discipline proved so incendiary that the colonial government restricted its execution to specific street corners in Paramaribo and to the authority of the colonial prosecutor. Andriessen's illustration of himself subjecting his pupil to the torture was perhaps drawn in a humorous vein. For example, the boy is not stripped naked, he's fully clothed, and also we couldn't possibly imagine that the boy's parents would allow such a torture to take place, so it's probably a humoristic portrait. But whether serious or not, the image communicates awareness in the Dutch metropole, in this case Amsterdam, of the harsh treatment accorded Africans in Caribbean slave societies. The first immigrants to Suriname originated in the western coast of Africa from about 2,000 miles across between the Gold Coast, which is today Ghana, coincides today with Ghana, the Slave Coast coinciding with what are today Togo, Benin, and Western Nigeria, and Luango, Angola, which are between the Congo River and Cameroon. The transatlantic traffic in these people peaked in 1790, when their population in Suriname reached a height of 60,000 individuals. According to one estimate, some 41% of Africans who lived in Suriname in the mid-18th century originated in the so-called Coromantine ethnic group. This is an English term referring to people from the Akan ethnicity from the Gold Coast in what is today Ghana. The
Interrupt for one moment, sorry. Just a request if you can make the presentation mode of the PowerPoint.
I did forget.
Just so we can see it full screen. Sorry, I apologize.
Much better, and don't apologize. Please feel free to interrupt if anything similar happens or if you have any questions too. And so the ever-expanding transatlantic slave trade database has significantly advanced our knowledge on the specific regions where most Africans came aboard on ship during particular years, but whether the place of embarkation is synonymous with nativity, and whether we can even speak about African ethnic groups as ethnicities are difficult questions. nor for the most part were transporters and purchasers of Africans interested in learning of, much less documenting, these origins or cultures. So in short, we know far more about the people who enslaved West Africans than we know about the West Africans themselves. And thanks largely to their own records, we know minute details about Jews who formed a very tiny proportion of broader Surinamese population. And we know comparatively little about the majority society, that is, people of African origin. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, 12.5 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic to the Americas. By contrast, in the entire Americas by the late 18th century, Jews numbered no more than about 5,000 individuals. 1/4 of them lived in Suriname. For all of these groups, but especially for Africans, dislocation was an expression of global capitalism. In Suriname, most of these forced migrants cultivated, harvested, and processed tropical produce, especially sugar, but also coffee, cotton, and cocoa. They comprised, as I mentioned before, upwards of 90% of Suriname's population by the late 18th century. And sugar is the main explanation for that proportion. It was a labor-intensive crop that relied on a huge workforce, 3 times as many laborers per acre as, for example, tobacco, and required extensive labor division and specialization, including preparing the ground, weeding, harvesting, transporting the cane to the mills, boiling the cane, grinding it down, and curing the juice from the cane. The extreme brutality executed against Suriname's enslaved populations, as historians now universally agree, was a function not of ethnicity, not of religion, of slave owners, nor of Dutch rule, but rather of sugar production itself. The production of sugar, together with the colony's extensive water management system, which involved digging, maintaining, and repairing polders as a form of water control, translated into a harsh disciplinary regime. And this regime was experienced as ceaseless mortal toil that so often incited the enslaved people to flight or to rebellion. The first and largest group of Jews in Suriname, and indeed in the entire Atlantic world as a whole, were what historians call Sephardic Jews. These Jews traced their origins to the forced conversions of Jews to Christianity that occurred in the Iberian Peninsula between the 14th and 15th centuries. Many of these forced converts left Spain and Portugal as Catholics and formally returned to public Jewish life, beginning in the late 16th century in Amsterdam, and then by the mid-17th century in London. They eventually formed offshoot communities in Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America. These successive forced conversions, in addition to a series of expulsions, resulted in the entire Atlantic coast of Europe being devoid of publicly professing Jews. And this was at a time when the region, the Atlantic coast of Europe, was becoming the hub of global trade. Before the mid-19th century, the Iberian exiles who returned to public Judaism usually referred to themselves as either Portuguese Jews or Spanish Jews, and collectively they referred to themselves as Spanish and Portuguese, and sometimes as Spanish and Portuguese members of the Jewish nation. And this was a really important part of my work because I started out assuming that the term Sephardic was accurate. But since my work involved a page-by-page reading of thousands and thousands of records, I found that there was absolutely no use of the term Sephardic when these Jews were describing themselves or other such communities elsewhere in the Atlantic world. And that helped me to realize that Sephardic, as a general application to Jews of Iberian origin, is a very recent application that only emerged in the late 19th century, primarily as a result of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the streaming in of Ottomans, in particular Sephardic Ottoman Jews, starting in the 1860s. So that's a little tangent, but that is actually the theme of my next book that I'm currently working on, which is an examination of the business lives of Ottomans, Muslims, Christians, and Jews who started to migrate westward in the 1860s. But back to Suriname, in idealistic spiritual terms, these communities in the Atlantic world, including in Suriname, they saw themselves as harbingers of the Jewish Messiah. Their settlement in territories devoid of Jews, including post-expulsion England and the Americas, was in the eyes of rabbis a prerequisite to the coming of the Messiah. And historian Jacob Marcus invented the word omni-territoriality to describe this Jewish mandate to settle far and wide, and also to describe the positive stance of these Jews towards their own exile. Their colonization in the New World was thus a negation of exile, shlilat galut in Hebrew, a continuation of the rabbinical idea that Jews were exiled for the purpose of serving as teachers to the nations. These expressions can be seen in the very names of the congregations that Jews gave to their own congregations in the Atlantic world, especially in the Caribbean, including the first Jewish congregation of Suriname, which was called Biracha v'Salom, blessing and peace, which was a direct reference to the mystical book of the Zohar, which has a reference equating the Garden of Eden to a place of blessing and peace. So coming now to Suriname specifically, Jews began to arrive in Suriname in the 1650s and came to form a significant portion of the white population. By the early 1800s, perhaps 2/3 of the white population of Suriname was Jewish. From the start, these Jews negotiated their political privileges with the colonial authorities, first with the British, well, the English, back then it was still England, between 1651 and 1667, and then they resumed those negotiation tactics with the Dutch, starting in 1667. Specifically, these Jews negotiated for communal autonomy. So communal autonomy is actually a scholarly term, meaning literally self-rule, two Greek words translating to self-rule. But Jews themselves did not call their privileges that they gathered, their legal status, corporate autonomy, but rather they called it privileges, privilegios in Portuguese, privilegios in Spanish, privilegien in French inflected Dutch, and these Jewish privileges, as you can see here, this is Recueil der Privilegien, or this is actually both in Dutch and French. And these privileges were negotiated starting in the 1650s, but they were successively negotiated generation after generation. So by the time you reach the early 1800s, the privileges are so myriad that the ledgers that contain the privileges have gotten thicker and thicker. And this is quite fascinating because the Ashkenazi Jews present in the colony, also since around the 1690s, so a bit later than the Portuguese Jews, they did not operate with such privileges. In other words, they were not negotiating for parallel privileges with the Dutch colonial authorities, but rather they were riding on the legislative coattails of the Portuguese Jews, so benefiting from all of the liberties that the Portuguese Jews had secured for themselves. However, Ashkenazi Jews did not form a corporate body. Their status was not a corporation. In contrast, the legal status of Portuguese Jews was in fact as a corporation. And you can think of this not exactly as a state within a state, but more a government within a government. So this is a time and a place of legal pluralism where the Jewish law, primarily Jewish secular law, was operating in an environment of Dutch law, which in itself was based on ancient Roman law in large part. So what were some of these privileges? Well, first of all, Jews had their own village, and this was the village of Jodensavanne. Jodensavanne is a Dutch word meaning Jews' savannah. And the passers-by and even the governor himself, Mauritius, in the mid-18th century, were astounded by this village. It was, in their knowledge, the only such village in the entire world where Jews lived and only Jews lived. And in fact, the land itself was owned cooperatively by the Jewish community, not by any individual, but rather by the Jewish community at large as a corporation. And this village, as I mentioned before, was located on the Suriname River. Adjacent to the rainforest, which you see there in the background, the tall trees that have not been chopped down, is where the rainforest begins. Some 90% of Suriname to this day is covered in rainforest. So the Jewish village was one expression of this corporate autonomy. There was no other ethnic group in the colony, or at least no ethnic group that endured, that had its own village that it owned and totally controlled. And this map shows you actually where the village was located and the plantations owned by Jews that radiated north, south, east, and west of the village. In addition to that, Jews successfully negotiated for their own schools to use their own languages, which were primarily Portuguese and secondarily Spanish and sometimes Dutch, and also sometimes Hebrew. And most importantly, Jews had their own tribunal. And so a tribunal is a court that operated autonomously from the colony, but often in conversation with colonial authorities. And this is what I meant by a government within a government. This is the clearest expression of a Jewish government within a colony, within another overarching government. And that is their tribunal. So in this tribunal, they could try any case involving only Jewish parties, but they could also call in enslaved people as eyewitnesses. So thanks to these court records, we also have the eyewitness accounts of enslaved people and also manumitted people who are not of Jewish ethnicity or religion. Jews also had a say in appointing the Raad van Politie, that is the council of policy, and this was a body of planters of male white Christians who were the advisors to the colonial government, and often not by the letter of the law, but in practice ruled the colony and had more power than the governor himself. So these are all extreme expressions of autonomy, and they were unparalleled in the Atlantic world. There is no other Jewish community that enjoyed all of these privileges together. And indeed, I was very hard-pressed to find a parallel example, even in some of the merchant-based cities of the Eastern Mediterranean and Southern Mediterranean, Leghorn being a very close competitor, but in Leghorn, the Jews had many mercantile privileges, but did not own their own village, for example. And according to the work of Ken Stowe, the legal autonomy of the Jews was actually much more fiction than fact. And in fact, the church authorities were really running the show in terms of the Jewish tribunal. This map shows you the concentration of Jewish plantations, and from the perspective of North America, the map is inverted, so the Atlantic Ocean is actually towards what we would consider the south of the map, and everything in the circle is where the Jewish plantations were concentrated. Now, all of these privileges together, the privilege of being considered white because Jews were most recently from Europe, there was no question about their racial identity. They were considered legally white, and therefore they were free, therefore they could own property, and they could own their own land, therefore they could own human property. And with all of those privileges under their belt, including communal autonomy, they also had the privilege of converting select members of the slave community to the Jewish religion. And anthropologists refer to that phenomenon as ethnogenesis, because these converts to Judaism, and in some cases they were direct descendants of Jews through the male, the slave owner, the master. This constitutes ethnogenesis, that is the creation of a people within a people. And indeed in Suriname, Eurafrican Jews did form a separate class. They were not only considered a separate class by the Jewish community itself, but they also self-segregated, and they formed their own prayer book sometime in the prayer group, sometime in the mid-18th century. And I just want to highlight the new research of Kami Fletcher, who is writing on radical death. I think that's her neologism. And her latest book focuses on the African-American Cemetery of Baltimore. And she makes the important point that a lot of the segregation that was occurring in the cemetery was actually self-segregation. And that was the quest of people of slave roots, a quest for dignity and autonomy. So her work very much resonates with my findings as well. Now, this illustration has been viewed very often in scholarly presentations and has been beautifully analyzed by historian Rivka Fink. So I won't spend much time on it other than to point you to her wonderful book called Creole Jews. And this book, Voyage à Suriname, Voyage to Suriname, which was published in 1839, has text with accompanying images. And it is an overview of the colony. It takes into consideration the various religious groups, the ethnic groups, the slave population, landscapes, animals, buildings, sugar works. But it also deals specifically with Jews. And the first image that the reader gets of Jews, as Rivka Fink notes, is this illustration of a number of slave women who are walking to their place of worship on a holiday. And the woman with her back towards us, who is dressed completely in white, is identified by Benoit as a Jewess. What's interesting about this is that all of these women are enslaved. We know that in part because they're barefoot, and by law, slaves could not wear shoes. They were not permitted to wear shoes. And so we know that, but what's quite interesting about the image is that Benoit does not blink twice about identifying a slave woman as a Jew. And indeed, slaves who were Jews were part of the landscape. By the early 1800s, it was not something unusual or freakish or something that needed to be explained. It only needed to be explained to the outside world, who found this astonishing. And it was explained to the outside world, but within the colony, this was part and parcel of the Jewish community and also part and parcel of the colony at large. And he painted this illustration during his sojourn in Suriname, and so we can imagine, and the date actually that he was there does actually coincide with a holiday, and so it coincides with the holiday of Easter and Passover, which that year did coincide. So we might imagine that this could be some kind of accurate depiction of what Benoit himself saw, even though we know that images are very, very problematic historically, and you can't accept an illustration the same way we might contemplate a photo today. Another example of the normalcy of Jews of African descent is this family photograph that my colleague Julie Marthe Cohen found in a business archive. And this is a family, the Fernandes family of Suriname, who owned a plantation called the Guinea's Friendship, Guinea's Vriendschap in Dutch. And this is a Portuguese Jewish family that posed sometime in the early 1900s. And in this illustration, you can see the father of the family, who is Fernandes himself, surrounded by his consort, his wife, to his left, and she is dressed in misikoti dress, which is the traditional Afro-Creole dress of Suriname. This is what descendants of slaves typically wear on holidays and special occasions. And then surrounding her are other members of the family, which include children and also in-laws, children-in-law. And the point of my book was actually to unravel the past and to figure out how this became normalized in the Jewish community, and also how these Eurafrican Jews perceive themselves specifically. So one of the family that I was tracking in my book was the Pelengrino family. Their name is spelled in various ways: Pelengrino, Pelengrino, Pelengrino in Portuguese. They themselves were very inconsistent about how it was spelled. But I traced the ethnogenesis of this family probably back to Senegambia, West Africa, thanks to the the scholarship of Peter Mark and José da Silva Horta, who discovered in an inquisitorial archive a Portuguese Jewish family from Amsterdam. They had returned to public Judaism in Amsterdam. The men had undergone circumcision, and then they made their way to the Senegambian coast sometime in the late 1500s, early 1600s, and they married local women, so women indigenous to Western Africa, and converted the children resulting from those relationships to Judaism. And the family name was Pelengrino. So we suspect, Peter, Mark, and I have discussed this at length, and we suspect there's some kind of connection between the Pelengrino family of Western Africa and that of Suriname. But so far, we have not found any kind of direct link. So I'll limit my comments to what we found in Suriname itself. And I found a marriage document in Suriname, it's now in Suriname, but traditionally it was housed in The Hague, in the National Archives of the Netherlands, which is located in The Hague. And what you're seeing here is a ledger of marriage contracts stretching across the 18th century. A number of these marriage contracts, which are written in the traditional Hebrew and Aramaic, are pertaining to people of slave origins. And the only way we know that the brides and grooms are of slave origin is because they were referred to by the rabbinical term mishuchrarim, mishuchrar, mishuchreret. So they are manumitted. And the reason why that is important is because, according to the practice of the colony, a manumitted Jew could only marry another manumitted Jew. So this couple married in 1721. They were clearly an agrarian couple. They lived in the hinterland of Suriname. They had plantations, they had plantation equipment, and they also owned slaves. So this is Jacob Mesias Pelengrino and his wife Rivka de Mattos, married in 1721. And this family, Pelengrino, it continues to be a Eurafrican family throughout the 18th century. So we found the tombstones, my team and I, when I did on-site work in Suriname in the late, when was it, the 1990s and early 2000s, we actually found the grave site of these Eurafrican Jews, including the Pelengrino family, which was very exciting. And then more recently, for the research that went into this book, Jewish Autonomy in a Slave Society, I found that the Eurafrican Jews, Miriam and her brother Joseph, they were very active in the community, as was their father Jacob. They were an extremely charitable family, and they were also themselves impoverished. By the mid-18th century, we see a decline in the social and legal status of Eurafrican Jews, which is part of a general decline of the status of people of color across the Atlantic world. It is a pushback against the increasing rights that people of color won for themselves over the decades, becoming slave owners in their own right. And this charity petition from 1758 gives us a glimmer of how some Eurafrican Jews perceive themselves. So this is Miriam. She is the daughter of Joseph Pelengrino. Sorry, I may have said Jacob before, but the daughter of Joseph Pelengrino, or Pelengrino. And in her petition to the Jewish leaders of Suriname, she quotes from the Hebrew Bible, and she says, "Do not turn away the pilgrim, now largues ao peregrino." She's quoting from a Portuguese translation of the Bible, and we actually know that Eurafrican Jews possessed prayer books in Spanish and Portuguese because their inventories say so. And she's quoting from the Hebrew Bible, from the book of Exodus, "Do not oppress the stranger." So it's kind of like a creative translation of "Não oprimirás o estrangeiro." She may also be engaged in a creative interpretation of the New Testament, the book of Matthew, which urges its students to give to the one who asks you and do not turn away, "Não largues," do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. This is also not surprising because, as Vika Fink has shown us, many of these Eurafrican Jews had half-siblings who were Christians, and they themselves would have been familiar with the New Testament either through contact with their half-siblings or because they themselves threatened to defect to the Christian religion if the Jewish community did not start to treat them better. And those are explicit threats received in some of the correspondence that I used for my book, and I'll soon discuss it. The sister of the aforementioned petitioner, Jacob, or Jacob, also the son of Joseph Pelengrino, so they had the same father, but perhaps different mothers. That was written in 1750, and this is the older brother of Miriam, and he also quotes from the Hebrew Bible, and he says, the holy law, so he's addressing himself to the Muhammad, which is the secular government of the Portuguese Jewish community. And he says, the holy law says that you are to have the same law for the foreigner and the native born. O lei tanto para o peregrino como o natural entre vós. Now, this is very important because the Pelengrino family were aware of what their last name meant. And in early modern Spanish literature, Pelengrino can mean pilgrim. It can also mean somebody who is spiritually wandering, but it can also mean a convert. And typically it is translated as a convert or as a foreigner or as a stranger. And so the Pelengrino family of Eurafrican Jews, they were aware of the meaning of their last name. They were also acutely aware of their second-class status within the Jewish community. And they were fluent enough in the sources and in the Portuguese language to play on the words of their last name. And they were savvy enough politically to use very, very, very effective tactics in drawing forth the pity, and perhaps even the empathy of the ruling Jewish class. So this slide brings us back to my earliest research on the Jewish community of Suriname, and this is the main cemetery of the rural Jewish community located in the Jewish village of Jodensavanne. This is the cemetery of Jodensavanne, located very, very close to the synagogue itself. And in the late 90s, my team and I, along with my co-author Rachel Frankel, we visited this cemetery hoping to find the Eurafrican plot. And we documented all of the epitaphs, translated them as well, transcribed them and transliterated them. And we also were very keen on finding the plot of Eurafrican Jews. We knew that by the late 18th century, during to their decline in legal status, these Jews were buried alongside the perimeter of the cemetery, so away from the choice spots of the cemetery. But we didn't know where that was. There were no cardinal directions in the archival records. So the team that I was working with walked around the perimeter of the cemetery with a long rod, trying to see if there were any stones buried beneath the surface of the soil. And as I was busy transcribing the surface of the epitaphs of the stone, I heard a joyful shout from across the cemetery and a lot of talking, and the voices were rising. So I quickly ran over there, and indeed, the team had found the Eurafrican plot. So 3 of the tombstones survived because they were made of stones, but all of the other grave markers had since disintegrated because they were made of wood. And this is actually the same thing that Dr. Fletcher has found in her work, that because of generalized poverty, people of African descent, and indeed many people in the white community, did not have the wherewithal to pay for lasting tombstones. So most of their memory is lost. But the cemetery itself preserves the dignity that the community wanted to preserve for its descendants. And so we correlated the archival document describing the layout of the bodies in the Eurafrican plot with the layout of the surviving epitaphs, stones in the Eurafrican plot of the actual cemetery. And we were able to recreate the entire burial plot. Similar plots existed, we know, in Casipora because they're alluded to in the archives, although we don't know where physically the plot was. And they also existed in the capital city of Paramaribo. And in that case, a burial book does survive, but the cemetery, alas, no longer survives. And here is from my first book. This is actually the transcription and translation of the Eurafrican plot and the Pelengrino family. And you can see there also the Mattos family that I alluded to before was also part of the Eurafrican plot. The quotes from the Bible are therefore highly significant. So I'm just going to end now because we're coming to the last minutes of our 45-minute period. I want to end with a few things that I learned about Eurafrican Jewish activism from my archival research in Suriname. And this pertains to a case that the historian Robert Cohen first uncovered in the 1990s. And this expression of communal activism was organized by a group of Eurafrican Jews who felt humiliated by their burial in the margins of the cemetery. They also did not like to be relegated to the margins of the synagogue during worship, or in the case of women, relegated to the back of the balcony. And so they asked and they petitioned the local Jewish authorities for equal rights. When these were denied, and when they started to feel an increased degree of humiliation, these Eurafrican Jewish activists approached the colonial governor, and the case made it all the way back to the metropole, to the Dutch metropole, and really split the community in half, and it was and shattered the foundation of Jewish communal autonomy itself, because the whole question of whether or not these laws, this government within a government was legitimate, came to the fore as a legitimate question. And so one of the arguments that these Eurafrican Jewish activists made was that their treatment as second-class citizens of the Jewish community contradicted the Torah. It contradicted Mosaic law, according to which there should be one ordinance or one law for both you of the congregation and for the stranger that sojourneth with you. And let's pay attention once again to the word stranger, a direct translation from the Portuguese word peregrino. And so here again, the community was drawing on its knowledge of Portuguese and its playful use of puns on words, and its savvy, canny use of local politics to fight for their equal rights. Although their fight was unsuccessful, and what I did find in my book is that what scholars previously said is that their activism was squelched by the white Jewish leadership, by the white Jewish community, and that their Eurafrican prayer house, founded in the mid-18th century, was forcibly disbanded. And what I found is quite the opposite, that the ruling class, the white Jewish leaders, advocated for the continued existence of the brotherhood, of the Eurafrican Jewish brotherhood that was known as the Darche Yesarim Siva. They advocated for its continuation, and they encouraged the community to document its bylaws. But the community within the community, so the brotherhood, collapsed because of attrition, because there were no longer active members who wished to continue the organization. And therefore, to the regret of the white Jewish government, the brotherhood disbanded in the 18-teens. But the memory of their activism, and indeed of their existence, remains, and it's sort of like an invisible monument. So the house of worship where they once worshipped has been torn down. It was torn down several generations ago. But the name of the plaza on which the brotherhood stood still captures the name of that brotherhood. So in Portuguese inflected Hebrew, the word for a brotherhood is siva. It comes from the Hebrew word yeshiva, which would be pronounced yesiba in Portuguese inflected Hebrew. And so the entire plaza where the worship house once stood is still to this day called the Siva Plain. So that is the plaza of the brotherhood, the Eurafrican Jewish brotherhood. So I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to answer any questions and also hear comments and any kind of ideas.
Really fascinating. First of all, thank you very, very much. I'm assuming people are waiting for me to open their microphones to ask. If you can stop sharing your PowerPoint, and then I am allowing our attendees, you may open your microphones and your cameras as soon as you're there. Please feel free to ask your questions. That's why I'm doing it. You will all be moved. Just give me a few minutes, sorry. But if there is, please feel free to open your cameras and microphones. I don't know. Sorry. So I did want to point out, I don't know, did you mention what that picture is behind you?
Right. So right behind me is a scene from the capital city of Paramaribo in Suriname. And we're seeing a synagogue adjacent to a mosque. And this is the original positioning of both of the buildings. When I did my research there in the late 90s, as I told the moderators at the start of this presentation, the president of the synagogue, whose name was actually Fernandes, he regularly played tennis with the imam of the mosque, and such were the friendly relations. And meanwhile, a totally different scene in the Middle East. But this helped remind me that Suriname, largely because of its slave history, is a totally different environment. So the mosque actually represents Indonesian immigrants who came to the colony in placement of slavery. When slavery was abolished in 1863 in Suriname, there was a period where, actually even before the abolition of slavery, there was a period when the government attempted to replace the slaves with indentured workers. And many of them came from Indonesia, and they were of a Muslim background, and still others came from India, and they came from largely a Hindu background.
Okay. Isaac, do you want to ask your question or give your comment, or would you rather I do it?
Sure, I can comment. I had been there a few times on business. I've traveled extensively on business. I run an international marketing company. They have a Chevra Kadisha room in the synagogue right behind the professor. I participated in the Tahara. I run the Chevra Kadisha on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And just an interesting point, I spent a couple, they were getting a new rabbi at the time. This was about 12 years ago. The synagogue and the mosque are next to each other, and on Yom Kippur at night after the fast, they all have a vegetarian meal together. And it's in the same, I think the land is owned together where they are. So there's other, I visited the community by boat. There was a woman whose name I forgot. I have pictures of it. It's fascinating, and it was very interesting, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. With your permission, I'm going to use your anecdote in my classes.
I can send you some pictures. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Did you want to open your mic and ask your question? You have to open your mic.
Okay, so you talked about what happened to the community through the middle of the, I think, 19th century, and you mentioned how they were discriminated against. What happened afterwards to this Eurafrican community and their descendants?
So far as I could tell, the Eurafrican community blended into the larger white Jewish community. And we know that in part because of the legislation. The legislation separating Eurafrican Jews from white Jews in the synagogue and in the cemetery disappears. It's actually outlawed in some cases by the Jewish community itself. In other cases, the governor, the Dutch colonial government itself, intercedes and abolishes these laws as contrary to the spirit of the times. Now, I'm not saying that hatred, hostility against Eurafrican Jews ceased. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that a separate community ceased to exist. So a separate organized activist community ceased to exist. So it blended into the overall community. And my suspicion, although I would need a team of genealogists to help me prove this, my suspicion is that everybody in the Jewish community of Suriname by the mid-19th century had some roots in slavery, however remote.
I'm gonna ask a question too. There was, when I was in Amsterdam talking to somebody from Suriname, I understood there were also Chinese slaves that were brought in, but you don't mention them. And it doesn't seem like.
No, I haven't heard about that in my, and I don't know the history you're talking about, so I'd love to hear more details. From my research, people from China, people from South Asia, from India, from the subcontinent, they were brought in as indentured servants. So they had a different legal status. In treatment, the treatment was very similar, in fact, to what bona fide slaves endured. But their legal status was indentureship. And that's really important because indentureship typically had an end date to it. Not that you would necessarily live that long in one piece, but there was a contract.
Cynthia, did you have a question? You need to open your microphone though. Wait, Cynthia, you need to open your microphone. No, we don't hear you. Still need to open your microphone.
You can now.
Okay.
I have a statement and a question. I actually went to Suriname way back in about 1970, but I didn't know there were any Jewish people there at the time. And I didn't know about it. It wasn't the purpose of my visit. And I wish I had known. The other thing I was going to say was about the Chinese. Some of them were brought in as slaves to do things like navying for building work after slavery, alongside and after slavery. They were brought in for really heavy labor.
That's probably the indenture.
That's what I read somewhere.
Well, right, when I was talking to Stanley Beck, if you know him in Amsterdam, that's what he was telling me, that he has some Chinese in his blood too, but it could very well be that it was indentured servants.
I'll look for that. But Cynthia Lewis, thank you for your comment. And I also wanted to say that Suriname's Jewish history has a more recent episode that I didn't really deal with in my book, but it's quite fascinating. Suriname was contemplated by the Freeland League as a refugee spot for Holocaust survivors, and it was seriously surveyed as the potential receiving spot for Holocaust survivors. And the Joint Distribution, JDC, Joint Distribution Committee, whose archives are located in New York, they actually preserve a lot of the archives from this episode, including letters from the Dutch government giving permission for these colonies to happen in Suriname.
Good, thank you.
David?
It's interesting because the constitution of most Sephardi communities from the 16th century onwards was generally fairly standard, and they generally followed the Venice model. But none of them had to cope with the slave population, or at least a substantial slave population in that way. Did they have two constitutions, or which were different, or did they have to vary their constitution in some way to cope with the idea of slaves?
So, David, is your question about Suriname or Venice? That's what I'm unsure about.
Suriname.
Right. So first of all, constitution is a Republican term. They didn't refer to their bylaws as constitution. So that comes after the French Revolution. And I'm glad you mentioned this. It's a really important point. They refer to their bylaws as privileges. And let me clarify. There are two bodies of legislation indeed. One are called privileges, and these are laws that are given by the Dutch government to the local Surinamese Jewish community. So these privileges would be things like, you are legally allowed to work your slaves on Sunday, even though it is a Christian holiday. You are allowed to have your own village, and it's called Jodensavanne. You're allowed to have it. Another body of legislation was for internal use only, and those are referred to by the Portuguese inflected Hebrew word askamot. It comes from the modern Hebrew word haskama, meaning agreement. And these askamot were internal bylaws. They were written in Portuguese for the community, and they had minutiae details about how to run the synagogue. Like most of these bylaws referred actually to how to run the synagogue, what were the various clerical positions within the synagogue, also some information about taxation, how the Jewish community was internally taxed. but it's things that the Dutch colonial authorities were not interested in until there occurred some kind of controversy within the Jewish community that spilled over to the colonial authorities or to the metropolitan authorities. And when it did become a cause célèbre, when it became a major controversy, then those internal bylaws were subject to scrutiny by both the colonial authorities and by the metropolitan authorities. So, that's not really an example of legal pluralism, but more an example of how there were two bodies of laws. One, how the Jewish community interfaced with the government and the metropolitan authority, and the other is how Jews interfaced with themselves, amongst themselves.
That's what I was interested in.
Thank you so much. Oh, I'm sorry, Isaac, did you want to say something else?
I was going to say that many of the Jews that are there, that are still there, they don't do very well. They own secondhand clothing stores on the main drag. They own some trading companies. So the Jewish community seems to be slowly but surely dwindling. They're way below the average income, even middle class. I mean, a lot of junk stores, secondhand stores. I was there last, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. So this is maybe it's changed in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
So I'll use that as a plug too before I let you speak, Professor, because in January, as part of our stories and memoirs, we're going to be talking about a kippah in the Caribbean, which definitely touches upon Suriname as well. And the Beck family, who I mentioned before, is featured in there too. And so some of those stories about what's going on there in the last 10, 15 years are there too. But now I'll let you give the more scholarly answer.
I just want to say that collectively here in our audience, we have some people who are very familiar with Suriname who've been there more recently than I. So I really hope that you'll publish your own experiences. All of this is really important information. Historians are interested in change through time, and we take a long view. So I encourage you all to record your experiences, whether they're travel experiences or experiences living there, or maybe you're from Suriname yourselves. And the other thing I want to say is that Suriname is a republic that is extremely rich in history and in culture and in languages, but it is also a country that grapples with poverty. And there is generalized poverty there, but at the same time, one of the things that my host took pride in is that you would never see a person starving in the street in Suriname. And I always remember that. And I always wanted to explore it as my understanding of current day Suriname as a place that, that has a very strong communal structure where people take care of each other. But like I say, I'm going to leave that to the people who are alive today, and they should tell their own stories.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Thank you. It really was wonderful. And thank you for closing off very strong this whole series. And we hope to see you in future series with your next book. So
likewise.
There you go.
Keep it up.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening, day, wherever you are in the world.
Everybody,
and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Jordan.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Professor Ben-Ur.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.